Hello everyone, I am the Storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. I remember the first time I moved into my new home in a completely unfamiliar city. It wasn't just a new house, it was a whole new world. New streets, new faces, and everything felt a little out of place. The excitement of the move was there, of course, but there was also a lingering sense of nervousness that I couldn't shake off. Everything about this new chapter felt like stepping into something unknown, and I wasn't entirely sure what I was walking into. The house itself seemed normal enough at first glance. It wasn't anything extraordinary, but it was cozy and comfortable. The walls were painted in neutral colors, and the furniture, although simple, fit together in a way that made the space feel inviting. There was a sense of calm when I walked through the front door, like it was just another home waiting to be filled with the usual daily routines. It was a fresh start, a blank canvas, and that's exactly what I needed. But as the days went on, I began to notice things that didn't quite sit right with me. At first, it was just small details, faint creaks in the floorboards, sounds that came from nowhere when I was alone in a room. The house, despite its simplicity, seemed to have a history of its own. I couldn't pinpoint it, but it felt like something old was lurking just beneath the surface. It wasn't the house's fault, of course. It wasn't as if it were haunted or anything like that. But it was a feeling that seemed to settle in the corners of my mind, making me second guess everything. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to get comfortable. And while I told myself that this was now my space, there were moments when I felt a disconnect. Something about the house made me feel like an outsider, as if I wasn't quite meant to be there. The rooms were too quiet, almost unnervingly so. There was no noise from outside, no traffic, no footsteps in the hallway. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to adjust. The silence became oppressive after a while, and I began to wonder if I was just imagining things. One evening, I was unpacking boxes in the bedroom, a simple task, but I couldn't help but notice the old wooden dresser that was already there. It didn't match anything else in the room. It wasn't a piece I would have picked, but had been left behind by the previous owners. I couldn't stop staring at it. The wood had an odd, almost worn texture, like it had been used for years, decades maybe. The faint smell of old wood and dust filled the air when I opened the drawers. Inside, I found old sheets, remnants of lives that once filled this space. It made me uneasy, like I was intruding on something that wasn't mine to touch. The more I explored, the more I began to notice things that seemed out of place. The way the door to the kitchen would creak, even when no one was around, or the feeling I got when I walked through certain rooms, as though they were holding something back, like there were secrets embedded within the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks, that I was just feeling the weight of the change. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and forgotten was woven into the very fabric of the house. I started to realize that I wasn't just adjusting to a new home, I was adjusting to a new layer of time. The house wasn't just new to me, it had been here for much longer, and it carried the weight of the past in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't necessarily a bad feeling, but it was definitely unsettling. The house was like a living, breathing entity with a memory, and I was trying to carve my own space within it. Each night, when I lay in bed, I'd stare at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts. I'd listen to the subtle creaks and sighs of the house settling into itself. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel comforting, but rather like something was lurking in the shadows, something old, something unfamiliar. My nervousness turned into a quiet unease. I couldn't help but feel that I was surrounded by memories, things that had been here long before I arrived, and things that would likely remain long after I left. It was a strange kind of uncertainty, a feeling of being both rooted and adrift. The house, with its old creaking bones, had a way of making me feel like I was walking through someone else's life. And while I knew that time would eventually ease the discomfort, it was hard not to feel like I was just a visitor in a space that wasn't entirely mine. When I first moved into my new home, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The excitement of starting fresh in a new city made me overlook the small details. But as days went by, I started noticing strange little occurrences, things that didn't make sense at first but slowly began to add up. These small, unexplained incidents didn't seem like much at first, but gradually they started chipping away at my peace of mind. It started with the lights. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was a fluke. One evening, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when the overhead light flickered. It was subtle, not enough to make me jump, but it was definitely noticeable. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a loose bulb or something with the wiring. But over the next few days, it happened again. And again. It wasn't just in one room either. The kitchen light flickered once. Then, the hallway light. At first, I told myself it was nothing more than an electrical issue that would get fixed soon. But deep down, something about it didn't sit right with me. There was no logical explanation for why it kept happening. Then there were the objects. Small items, things I knew I hadn't moved, seemed to change position. A glass of water that I had placed on the kitchen counter would be on the edge of the table the next morning, as if someone had gently nudged it across the surface. A book I had set down on the shelf was later found slightly askew, its cover facing a different direction. Nothing major, but enough to make me pause and wonder, had I done that myself without realizing? I couldn't quite convince myself that I had. The feeling was unsettling, like the house itself was shifting things around, almost as if it had a life of its own. I began to feel a strange sensation in the silence of the house. It was the kind of quiet that you don't notice at first, but after a while, it becomes almost suffocating. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It wasn't calm. It felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in, the air itself too thick to breathe. I would sit in a room, doing nothing in particular, and the silence would press in on me from all sides. It was an overwhelming stillness, and I couldn't figure out why it felt so unnatural. It wasn't the type of silence you feel when everything is calm. It was a heavy silence, like something was watching, waiting. I tried to push away the thought, telling myself it was just the normal quiet of a new place, but the unease never quite left. These small events didn't seem like much at first. I kept telling myself it was just me adjusting to a new place, a new routine. Maybe the lights were faulty. Maybe I was imagining the position of things. Maybe the silence was just a part of living alone, in a home that was far removed from the constant buzz of the outside world. But with each passing day, I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, tell myself I was overthinking, but each incident seemed to build on the last, until I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't help but wonder, had I ever experienced something like this before? I'd lived in different places throughout my life, but nothing had ever felt like this. Sure, I'd had the occasional flickering light or misplaced item, but it never felt as persistent as this. The sense of quiet wasn't like the peaceful solitude of being alone. It was more like the kind of silence that surrounds you when you're in an empty room, and yet you feel like you're not really alone. I had no concrete reason to feel this way, but the feeling of something being off was undeniable. Was it just my imagination? Could I be reading too much into these little things? My mind kept cycling through explanations, tiredness, anxiety from the move, a natural response to being in a new space. I told myself that the stress of adjusting was making me hyper aware of every little noise or movement. Maybe I was just feeling overwhelmed by everything new, the unfamiliar environment, the isolation, the transition. But still, the more these things happened, the more my anxiety grew. The lights flickering, the objects shifting, the suffocating silence. It wasn't just normal. It was starting to feel strange. And the more I tried to push the thought away, the more it crept back, tugging at the edges of my thoughts. One night, I was sitting in the living room reading a book when the light above me flickered again. This time, it wasn't just a quick blink. It flickered several times, like it was struggling to stay on. I could feel my heart race a little, but I tried to stay calm. It was just a light, I told myself, nothing more. But then the flickering stopped, and the light went completely out. In the moment of darkness that followed, I could feel my chest tightening. I fumbled for the switch and turned the light back on. The room lit up, but I couldn't shake the cold feeling that seemed to fill the space around me. The next day, I found that the small decorative vase on the coffee table had shifted. It wasn't far, just enough to notice. It made me pause. The more I looked at it, the more I realized something was wrong. It wasn't just the vase, it was everything. The flickering lights, the shifting objects, the silence. Everything was adding up. But what was it? Was it my mind playing tricks on me, or was there something more to it? I wasn't sure what to make of all of it. I tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to stress and nerves. But deep down, I knew something was happening, and I couldn't help but feel that, with each passing day, it was only going to get worse. It was a quiet evening, one of those still nights where the air felt thick with the weight of silence. I was sitting in my room, my back against the wall, just lost in thought. The soft hum of the house settling in around me was the only sound that filled the space. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I had been in the house for a few weeks by this point, and the oddities I had noticed were starting to pile up in my mind. The flickering lights, the strange shifts in objects, and the thick silence, they had all become part of my new normal. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. I was sitting in my chair, reading a book, when I heard a faint noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft creak like the house was shifting. I didn't think much of it at first. I'd heard these sounds before, so I just brushed it off. But then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The door to my room, which I had clearly closed earlier, was slowly swinging open. At first, I thought I must have left it slightly ajar. But no, there was no way. I had made sure to close it firmly before sitting down. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the door had always been open and I simply hadn't noticed. But as I stared at the door, I could see it moving, just a little, creaking as it swung wider, inch by inch. The room, which had felt so still and secure moments before, suddenly felt wrong. Shock hit me first. My body felt paralyzed, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The door was definitely moving on its own. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and an icy chill ran down my spine. It wasn't like a gust of wind that could explain it. The air was still, and there was no breeze. I was alone in the room, with no one else nearby. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stood up, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that was creeping in. I moved toward the door, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I reached it, I quickly shut it again, my hand shaking as I pushed it closed with more force than necessary. I leaned against the door for a moment, taking a few deep breaths, trying to steady myself. It wasn't just that the door had opened, it was the feeling that had come with it. The sense that something wasn't right, something was in control, and it wasn't me. But just as I thought I had calmed down, a new wave of fear washed over me. I heard it again, the creak. The door was slowly opening once more. This time, I couldn't convince myself it was just my imagination. I was wide awake, I was sure of it. And yet, the door moved again, just as slowly, just as unnervingly, as if some invisible force was pushing it open, little by little. I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was to shut the door again, to lock it and secure myself in my room. I moved forward quickly, but my hands were trembling too much to grab the handle. When I finally did, I slammed the door shut, locking it this time. The noise echoed in the room, louder than I had intended. I stepped back, trying to regain control of my emotions. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just a random event. It wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. Something was happening. Something beyond my understanding. I sat back down in my chair, my body trembling as I tried to focus on something, anything else. The room, which had once felt so comforting and safe, now felt cold and hostile. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every creak in the floor felt like footsteps in the hallway. The silence had returned, but it wasn't peaceful this time. It was suffocating. I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over in my mind. Had I imagined it? Could there have been a logical explanation? My heart wanted to believe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me, but my gut told me otherwise. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. What could make a door move like that? What could make it swing open when no one was there? It didn't feel like a simple draft or a faulty hinge. It felt intentional, like something or someone was trying to communicate. For the first time since moving into the house, I felt a deep sense of dread. It was no longer just the flickering lights or the misplaced objects. It was this moment, this door, moving as though it had a mind of its own. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a simple case of nerves or anxiety. There was something more to this, something that I couldn't explain, and it terrified me. I tried to push the thought away, to tell myself that I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something paranormal was happening. It wasn't just a series of coincidences or my imagination running wild. No, this was different. This was real. And as I sat there in the darkness of my room, I knew I had crossed a line. Whatever was happening in this house was beyond my control. The fear was all-consuming now, and I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I could feel it. Whatever force had opened that door was still there, watching me. And as the night wore on, I sat there in the silence, too terrified to move, too confused to think clearly. But knowing that something had changed. This was no longer just a strange house. It was something else entirely. Something dark, something ancient, something waiting. After that night with the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in my house. I began to question everything. The flickering lights, the strange occurrences, the oppressive silence. It all started to feel connected, like there was something lurking beneath the surface that I couldn't see. I needed answers. So, I began my search. I spent hours online, digging through old records and trying to uncover any piece of information about my new home. At first, I couldn't find anything. The house seemed to have no notable history, no significance. But after a while, I stumbled across an old forum dedicated to the history of homes in the area. Someone had posted a few details about the house I now lived in, buried deep in the thread, and it caught my eye. It was a small, almost overlooked entry, but it was enough to make me pause. The house had once belonged to a family, a couple with a young daughter. From what I could piece together, the tragedy that had unfolded here was horrifying. The couple had lived in the house for many years, but their lives were shattered one fateful evening when the daughter was found dead. No one knew exactly what had happened, but the whispers suggested that it was an accident, one that could have been prevented. The details were vague, but there was one thing that everyone seemed to agree on. The family had never been the same after that night. There were rumors that the house was haunted by the spirit of the young girl, lost and seeking justice for her untimely death. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. I could feel the walls of the house pressing in around me as the information sunk in. The realization that this house, my house, had witnessed such a tragedy, that something so painful had happened within these walls, made the air feel thick. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was something else. Something darker. The weight of the history of this place started to settle into my bones, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every room in the house seemed to hold a memory now, a moment frozen in time that I hadn't been able to see before. It was like I could feel the presence of the family who had lived here, the echo of their grief still hanging in the air. I began to wonder, was the house truly haunted, or was it something else entirely? Was it just the lingering sorrow of the family that had once called this place home? Or was it something darker, something more sinister that had been left behind? The idea that the spirit of the young girl might still be in the house lingered in my mind. The strange occurrences, the door opening, the objects shifting, suddenly made sense. I felt a connection to whatever was here, as though it was aware of me, watching me, waiting for me to understand. The thought that the entity might now be attached to me sent chills down my spine. I had moved into this house with no idea of its past, no awareness of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But now, it felt like the house and I were connected, as if something from the past had reached out to me, pulling me deeper into its story. As I continued to learn more about the history of the house, I started to feel a strange, unsettling presence around me. It wasn't just the cold spots or the creaks in the floor. It was the way the atmosphere changed when I thought about the tragedy. It felt like the house was alive with memories, with emotions that weren't my own. I could almost feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, as though the house itself was trying to communicate with me. The more I learned, the heavier the air around me became. It was like the house was feeding off my fear, growing stronger the more I uncovered. This newfound knowledge only added to my sense of dread. I couldn't escape it now. The history of the house had become a part of me, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The spirits of the past, the sorrow, the tragedy, it all felt so real now, as if the house had never truly let go of its dark history. The thought that something from the past might be watching me, following me, made me feel like there was no way out. I was trapped in a house that held more than just memories. It held the weight of the past, and now it was refusing to let me go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how deep this connection ran. The house wasn't just a building. It was a living entity shaped by everything that had happened within it. And now, it had me. It had tied itself to me, dragging me into the story of its past, whether I wanted to be a part of it or not. I had no idea what to do with this information, how to escape from it. The weight of it all pressed in on me, making it harder and harder to breathe. As the days passed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, hearing strange noises that I couldn't explain. Every creak, every rustle made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house felt more alive now, more present, as if it had become a part of me. The psychological tension was unbearable, and it felt like the house would never let me leave. With each new piece of information, with each new layer of the house's history that I uncovered, the tension inside me grew. I couldn't escape it. The past was no longer just the past. It was here, in the present, and it was getting harder to ignore. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was living in a haunted house, and there was no escaping it. It all came to a head one night, when the house felt different, darker, heavier. The silence was more oppressive than usual, and for some reason, the air felt colder than it had before. The events of the past few days had left me on edge, and that night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. I had just settled into bed, trying to forget the haunting history of the house, trying to focus on anything else. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the eerie stillness around me. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, it began. It started with a faint sound, almost like a whisper, a faint rustling in the air. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind outside. But then the sound grew louder. It was unmistakable now, a low, eerie hum, like a voice calling from somewhere deep within the walls. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something or someone was in the room with me. And then it appeared. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure I recognized. It was the same face I had seen in my dreams, in flashes of fear and confusion. The ghostly figure, the one I had imagined so many times, was now standing before me, real and tangible. It was a woman, her features obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking it. I knew who she was. She was the spirit of the young girl who had died in this house, the one whose tragic fate had haunted its walls for years. For a moment I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. I was staring at the ghost of the girl, watching as she stood there, motionless, her eyes locked onto mine. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, a cloud of mist that seemed to hang in the air. The room felt like it was closing in on me, like the walls were pressing against me, making it harder to breathe. The weight of her presence was suffocating. But then something shifted inside me. The fear, the panic. It was still there, but it was joined by something else. A surge of adrenaline, a survival instinct that kicked in. I couldn't let this thing control me. I couldn't let it take over. I had to do something. I quickly tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak, as though they were made of rubber. The figure in the corner didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting for me, watching me, as though it knew what I was going to do next. My mind raced. Should I fight it? Should I try to communicate with it? Or should I run, get out of there as fast as I could? The decision hit me in an instant. I couldn't fight it. I didn't know how to fight something like that. This wasn't something I could physically confront. This wasn't a person. This wasn't even a being I could reason with. My instincts told me to run, to get out of the room, to escape before it could do anything else. But the figure seemed to sense my fear, and as if on cue, it began to move toward me. Its body was still shrouded in shadow, but I could see its face more clearly now, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something much darker, much more malicious. I could feel its presence crawling into my mind, suffocating my thoughts, making it harder to think clearly. I needed to move. I needed to get out of that room. With every ounce of energy I had left, I bolted for the door. I wasn't sure how I managed to open it, but somehow I did. I ran down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving faster than they had ever moved before. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't want to know if it was following me. I just had to keep going. I burst into the living room, gasping for breath, my body trembling from head to toe. My mind was racing, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. What was that thing? What was it trying to do to me? And why had it waited until now to reveal itself? But even as I stood there in the middle of the living room, trying to catch my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That thing, whatever it was still here, somewhere in the house. It was toying with me, feeding off my fear, and I knew that I couldn't outrun it forever. Eventually, it would come for me again. I paced the living room, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to figure out what to do next. But nothing made sense. I had been trapped in the house, trapped by its dark history, and now it felt like the house had taken on a life of its own, drawing me deeper into its web. I couldn't escape it. Not now. Not ever. As the minutes ticked by, I realized that I had two choices. I could keep running, keep hiding, but I knew that eventually I would have to face whatever was in that house. Or I could confront it, stand my ground, and try to make peace with the thing that had haunted this place for so long. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed. I didn't know what it wanted, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let it control me any longer. It was time to end this, once and for all. The days after that terrifying encounter felt like a blur. I had confronted the entity, faced my fear, and for a brief moment, I thought everything would be okay. I told myself that the spirit, or whatever it was, had finally heard me. I stood my ground, and somehow, I felt like I had won. But even after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't the overwhelming fear that had gripped me before, but a lingering sense of unease. I began to feel like the house had become a part of me, like the entity's presence was still there, hovering just beyond my reach. I told myself that I was safe now, that the spirit wouldn't harm me anymore. I had confronted it head on, and I had made my peace. But the thing about spirits, about the unknown, is that it never really leaves. The fear, that unsettling feeling, it lingers long after the encounter. It's always there in the back of your mind, just waiting for a moment of weakness to reappear. Even now, as I sit in the comfort of my new home, the shadows feel heavier. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind makes me wonder if it's back. I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the corners of rooms, half expecting to see those same hollow eyes staring back at me. It's almost like the fear has imprinted itself onto my mind, and no matter how much I try to ignore it, it's always there. I left that house, of course. I had to. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that happened. But leaving didn't change the feeling. The fear didn't vanish when I walked out the door. It followed me. Maybe it's in the house, or maybe it's in me now. I don't know. The lines between reality and the supernatural have blurred, and I'm not sure where one ends and the other begins. I sometimes wonder if I'll ever truly be free from that experience. The house might be gone, but the memories linger. And I wonder, as I sit here in this new place, whether it's still out there, watching me, waiting for the next time I let my guard down. So I ask myself, am I truly safe? Or is it still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again? I don't have the answers. Maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, that night changed me. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. And even though I'm no longer in that house, I can't escape the feeling that the supernatural is always just one step behind. The fear isn't gone. It's simply waiting for its next chance. It was supposed to be a fresh start, moving to a new city, a new town that promised a quieter, more peaceful life. A place far from the rush and noise of the old city, where everything had begun to feel a little too suffocating. But even though the town appeared to be calm, there was something about it that felt off. It wasn't the kind of place where anything bad happened, at least not visibly. It was the kind of town that seemed untouched by time, where everything moved slowly, almost deliberately. The house we moved into wasn't large, but it had character. An old place, a little worn but full of history, with thick stone walls and creaky wooden floors that seemed to sigh under your weight. From the moment I entered, it felt like stepping into a story that I didn't quite understand, a story that was yet to be told. There was a strange, lingering energy in the air, something subtle but unshakable, that left me feeling like I wasn't entirely alone in the house. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. New places do that to you, don't they? They make you feel like you're constantly being watched, like the walls are holding their breath, waiting for something. But that's what this house was, full of small things that made me feel like something was hiding just around the corner, something I couldn't name or place. The rooms felt strange, not in a menacing way, but in a quiet, unspoken way that tugged at me. The floors creaked with a rhythm that seemed far too deliberate, almost as though they were echoing a secret kept long ago. The air was a little too still, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, and every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something, a shadow crossing a doorway or a slight rustle behind me. But when I turned to look, it was always gone. Just the house, I told myself. Just the house settling. The windows, too, would always let in just enough light to cast long, twisting shadows on the walls, even during the day. And at night, the silence would grow so thick that it almost felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. And yet, it wasn't any one thing that gave me the sense of unease. It was everything combined, all the little things that seemed to whisper to me in the quiet moments. The soft scratching sound that came from the attic, the feeling of eyes on the back of my neck when I sat alone in the living room. It wasn't the kind of thing you could put into words. It was more of a sensation, a constant hum in the air that kept me on edge. The house seemed alive in its own way, but not in a way that was obvious. It wasn't a house that shook or groaned, but one that settled deep into your bones, making you aware of the way the wood creaked beneath your feet and the way the floorboards shivered under the weight of nothing at all. The walls, though solid, felt fragile in places. The paint, peeling in some corners, had an odd texture, as though it had absorbed years of stories, some forgotten, some still whispering. The light in the house was different, too. The way it filtered through the curtains during the day, casting an eerie glow on the walls that made the house feel smaller, more confined. At night, the moonlight would pour through the windows, casting long streaks of silver light that seemed to dance along the floors, like they were following me as I moved from room to room. The silence was the most unsettling thing. It wasn't a peaceful silence, the kind you get when the world is still and calm. It was a silence that felt too heavy, as though it had settled over the house like a blanket, muffling everything, leaving only the faint sounds of the house itself. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind outside brushing against the windows. It was the kind of silence that made you listen more intently, and when you did, you began to hear things you couldn't explain. Faint rustling noises from upstairs, the soft shuffling of footsteps behind you when you were sure you were alone, and the distant sound of a door creaking open at night when everyone was asleep. I would sit in my room, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. I could hear the faintest hum, almost like the house was breathing, a soft, steady sound that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. There were nights when I would lie in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the soft wind outside, wondering if the sounds I heard were just my imagination, or if the house truly had a life of its own. It wasn't the kind of thing you could ever really put into words, just a sense of discomfort, a whisper of something that didn't quite belong. There were moments, too, when the house seemed to feel colder than it should, especially in the corners, the kind of cold that crept into your bones, settling around you even when the heater was on. The air would grow still, too still, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And in those moments, I would always find myself glancing over my shoulder, wondering if someone was standing just out of sight. But when I turned, the room was always empty. It was these moments, these small, unsettling details, that kept me on edge. Nothing overtly dangerous, nothing threatening, but a constant feeling of being watched. A feeling that only grew stronger with time, like the house itself was trying to tell me something. A story buried deep in its bones that it was waiting to share. It started with something small, barely noticeable. The first night I spent in the house, I thought it was just the old walls settling. I had heard about how houses like this creak and moan when they're left alone, their wooden bones groaning under the weight of time. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the eerie silence that hung in the air. And then I heard it. At first it was faint, so faint that I thought I had imagined it. A soft scrape, like a chair leg being moved across the floor. I turned my head toward the sound, but the room was still, the shadows stretching across the floor in a way that made everything look like a part of the darkness itself. I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling again, maybe an old piece of furniture shifting in the breeze. After all, I had just moved in, and new places always have those strange noises. But as the days passed, the noises didn't stop. They began to happen more frequently, like they were becoming a part of the house's rhythm, its heartbeat. A faint scratching sound from the attic, the soft thump of something being dropped upstairs, followed by complete silence. I tried to ignore them, tried to convince myself that it was nothing. But the longer I stayed, the harder it was to pretend that these sounds were just a coincidence. It was always the same. A chair scraping across the floor, the sound of footsteps, a door creaking open in the dead of night. And sometimes there would be a silence that was so thick, so absolute, that I couldn't breathe without feeling like it was pressing in on me from all sides. My mind would race, spinning in circles, asking the same questions over and over. What was that? Was it the house settling again? Was it the wind? Or was something else at play here? I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding in my chest, convinced that someone was standing just out of view watching me. The silence would stretch out, suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of something, papers maybe, or the wind shifting outside. But then I would hear it again, the scrape of a chair, the sound of someone walking across the floor. I would sit up, heart in my throat, staring at the dark corners of the room, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I had been through a lot recently, moving to a new town, a new home. Everything felt unfamiliar. It was easy to blame my heightened senses on the stress of everything. The constant change, the fact that I was living in a place so old, so full of history, that it was bound to make strange sounds. But even then, something didn't sit right. Each night, I would lie there, staring into the darkness, listening for the sounds, and they always came. At first, it was easy to brush off. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid. But soon, the feeling of being watched started to creep in. It was subtle at first, like a shadow moving just out of the corner of my eye, or the feeling of cold air brushing past my skin when I was alone. But it wasn't just the cold, or the flicker of the lights, or the sounds in the distance. It was something else. It was the way everything seemed to stop when I entered a room, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And when I would leave the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, just out of reach. There were nights when I would try to sleep, but the sounds kept me awake. A faint tapping on the walls, the distant thud of something heavy being moved, the sound of creaking floorboards from the room above mine. I could never tell where they were coming from, Sometimes it felt like they were right next to me, and other times they felt far away, like they were echoing through the walls. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, the noises wouldn't stop. They just kept coming, always at night, always when the house was quiet enough for me to hear them clearly. I would get up, my heart racing in my chest, and check every room. Nothing. But the silence would return, only to be broken by the next sound. It was maddening. I couldn't figure out where it was coming from, or if it was even real. And every time I would start to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I would hear something else. A door creaking open, a chair scraping across the floor. It was always the same noises, repeated over and over again, as though they were stuck in a loop. One night, after hearing the sound of footsteps outside my room, I decided to follow them. I got up as quietly as I could and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark, the air thick with that same oppressive silence. I walked down the hall, my footsteps barely audible on the old wooden floor. The sounds were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I reached the stairs and stood there, listening. The silence stretched out around me, broken only by the distant sound of something, just out of reach. The next few days passed in a blur, the noises continuing to grow more persistent, more unsettling. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the way the shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, the way the lights flickered at the same time every night, as though they were signaling something. I felt like I was slowly losing touch with reality, like the world around me was slipping away, bit by bit. It was then that I started to wonder, was I going crazy? Or was there something else in the house, something that didn't belong? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the sounds, the shadows, the strange feeling of being watched, they were all connected. Something was in this house, something that had been here long before I arrived. But I couldn't let myself think about it too much. I couldn't let my mind wander into the realm of things I couldn't explain. The fear was already starting to take root, twisting itself around my thoughts like a vine, and I had no idea how to pull it out. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same soft scraping noise, followed by the faintest sound of footsteps. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, and for the first time since I had moved in, I felt the full weight of the house on me, the feeling that it was no longer just an old building, but something far darker, something alive in a way I couldn't explain. I had tried ignoring the strange noises for weeks, dismissing them as the creaks and groans of an old house settling. But the more I heard them, the more I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the way they lingered in the air, like a lingering whisper, something that couldn't be erased, something that refused to leave. I needed answers, and I had to find them. One afternoon, I decided to do something I hadn't yet considered, look into the history of the house. Maybe there was something in the past that could explain the noises. At first, I thought it was just a way to occupy my mind, a distraction from the fear that had begun to consume me. But the deeper I dug, the more unsettling things became. I started by researching the house's history, its construction, who had lived here, when it had been built. The first few pages I read were inconclusive, filled with basic details. But something in the back of my mind told me to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface. So I spent days sifting through old records at the local library, talking to people who had lived in the area for years, asking about the house and its former residents. Most of them hadn't heard anything unusual about it, but the more I asked, the more I could sense something was being left unsaid. One elderly man, who seemed to know the town's history better than anyone else, mentioned that there was a strange feeling about the house when he was a boy. He couldn't pinpoint why, but he recalled hearing stories about the place being haunted. He said it had always been avoided by the locals, especially after the tragic death of the original owner, a man named Robert Hawthorne. According to the man, Robert had lived alone for years in the house, and no one was quite sure what had happened to him. There had been rumors, of course, but no one ever confirmed the details. Some claimed he'd gone mad, others said he had been killed under mysterious circumstances. The old man had no definitive answers, but his words stuck with me, like a dark seed that began to take root in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Robert Hawthorne, about his tragic death, and the strange rumors that had surrounded him. I decided to dig further to see if I could find anything concrete that might explain the eerie atmosphere in the house. I spent hours at the library reading through old newspapers and finally stumbled upon a mention of a fire that had occurred in the house several decades ago. The fire had claimed the lives of several people, one of them, Robert Hawthorne. The article described how he had died in the flames, alone, with no one around to save him. It was strange. The article made it sound like an accident, but there was something about the way the story was told that didn't sit right with me. It was almost too impersonal, too distant, as if the writer was trying to distance themselves from something uncomfortable. I kept reading, searching for any clue, anything that could explain the unsettling feeling I had in the house. But all I found were more questions, more mysteries, and less clarity. That night, I went back to the house, determined to keep my mind off the eerie discoveries I had made. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. But as I entered the front door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt heavier, as though it had been waiting for me. I walked through the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence, when I suddenly stopped in my tracks. I had heard a sound. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to make me pause, soft like the shuffle of something moving across the floor. It came from upstairs, from the direction of the attic. My heart skipped a beat. I had checked the attic earlier that day, and there was nothing there. But the noise, it was unmistakable. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I walked slowly up the stairs, the creaking of the old wood under my feet amplifying the silence around me. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, and I could barely make out the shapes of the furniture in the dim light. But as I moved forward, something caught my eye. It was a piece of furniture, an old wooden chair. It wasn't there earlier. I was sure of it. It sat in the middle of the hallway, its legs angled in a way that suggested it had just been moved. But there was no sign of anyone having been here. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run through my body. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. And I didn't know if it was the house or my own mind that was playing tricks on me. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the hallway, next to the chair, was something I hadn't noticed before. A small, dusty object, half hidden under a pile of old cloth. I walked closer, my breath shallow, and carefully lifted the cloth. Beneath it, I found an old, worn-out diary. The pages were yellowed with age, and the leather cover was cracked and faded. I opened it slowly, not knowing what to expect, and began to read. The diary belonged to Robert Hawthorne. As I read through its pages, I was disturbed to find that he had written about strange occurrences in the house, noises that couldn't be explained, a feeling of being watched, and an overwhelming sense of dread. His words mirrored my own experiences, as though he had been living in the same house, feeling the same things years before me. But there was something even more disturbing in the diary. Robert had mentioned a figure, a shadowy figure that seemed to follow him, appearing at the edge of his vision, just out of reach. He described how it would move around the house, always just out of sight, but always there. And as his writings became more frantic, he began to talk about how he couldn't escape it, how he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was slowly driving him mad. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of his words pressing in on me. It was as though I was stepping into his mind, feeling his fear and confusion as he had. I couldn't help but wonder, had he gone mad, or had something truly been haunting him, just as it was haunting me? And then, as I reached the final pages of the diary, I found a chilling entry, one that sent a shiver down my spine. Robert wrote, "It's not just the house, it's me. I can feel it now. It's inside me, and when it's ready, it will take me." I closed the diary, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in this house, whatever had driven Robert to madness, was still here. And it wasn't just the house that was haunted, it was me too. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the noise I had been hearing, the feeling of being watched, it wasn't my imagination. It was real. Something was in this house, and it wasn't going to let me go. The question was, would I be able to escape it, or would I become just another part of the house's dark history? The noises started as whispers in the dark, something that could easily be dismissed as the house settling or the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. But the longer I lived there, the harder it became to ignore them. At first they were subtle, a faint creaking of the floorboards, the soft rustle of fabric in the hallway. But they grew stronger, more persistent, until they began to feel almost intentional. Every night, as soon as the house quieted down and the world outside fell asleep, the sounds would start. A chair scraping against the wooden floor, the slow, deliberate tapping of footsteps, a door creaking open, just a little. The first few nights I brushed them off, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks. But the more I heard, the less certain I became. Then came the night it all changed. I was lying in bed, my eyes wide open in the dark, the house silent except for the faint rustle of the wind outside. But this time, the sound wasn't distant. It was right there, at the foot of my bed, the soft scrape of fabric like someone dragging their feet slowly across the floor. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound continued, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking around my room, just out of view. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and switched on the lamp. The light flickered for a moment before it steadied, casting long shadows across the room. The sound stopped instantly, leaving the air thick with tension. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling again. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. It wasn't the house. It was something else. The next few nights, the noises grew more intense. The scraping of the chair, the tapping of footsteps, it was all getting closer, as if whatever was making the noise was trying to get my attention. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and every part of me screamed to run, to leave, to get out. But I couldn't. I was trapped. And the more I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the more I realized it wasn't. One night, I was sitting in the living room, trying to read, when I heard it. A loud crash came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was happening. I rushed up the stairs, my pulse racing. The hallway was dark, the shadows creeping across the walls as I walked slowly, every step heavy with dread. As I approached the room at the end of the hall, I froze. The door was ajar, and inside I could see it. Something was moving, shifting in the darkness. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A chair was rocking gently back and forth, as though someone had just stood up and walked away, but no one was there. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt colder now, the temperature dropping with every second that passed. As I reached out to touch the chair, the sound of footsteps behind me made me spin around, my breath catching in my throat. No one was there. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to focus. I needed to know what was happening, needed to understand why I was feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. But the more I searched, the more I realized there was nothing to find. No explanation, no logical reason for the strange occurrences in the house. Just the noises, the movement, the cold air that seemed to follow me wherever I went. It was then that I began to question myself. Was I losing my mind? Had the stress of the move, the isolation, the strange events I had been experiencing finally caught up with me? I couldn't deny that the fear was real. It gripped me, suffocated me. But was it my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something truly happening? Something I couldn't explain? The confusion began to settle in, swirling in my thoughts like a dark cloud. My perception of reality started to blur, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Was the house really haunted, or was I simply unraveling from within? The line between what was happening and what I was imagining became thinner and thinner with each passing day. One afternoon, I decided to do something I had been avoiding. I went into the attic. It was a place I had never ventured before. The door had always been locked, and I never felt the need to open it until now. Something inside me urged me to look, to face whatever it was that had been lurking in the shadows, to confront the source of the noises. And so I unlocked the door, my hand trembling as I turned the key. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. But as I stepped inside, I immediately felt the temperature drop. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and age. As I moved deeper into the room, I saw something in the corner. It was a small wooden chest, old and weathered, like it had been sitting there for decades. I approached it cautiously, my breath shallow, and knelt down to open it. Inside, I found nothing but old papers, faded photographs, and trinkets from another time. But as I sifted through the items, I came across something that stopped me cold. A small, tattered journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened the journal carefully, scanning the faded handwriting. It was Robert Hawthorne's, the very man whose tragic death had been whispered about by the locals. As I read through his entries, I felt the weight of his fear pressing against me. He described the same noises, the creaking, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. He spoke of how he couldn't escape the presence in the house, how he felt it following him, creeping closer every night. But what struck me the most was the final entry. It's not just the house, it's inside me now, and soon it will take me completely. The journal fell from my hands, its final words echoing in my mind. I had thought I was alone, that the house was simply a place of strange occurrences. But now I knew the truth. Whatever haunted this house had a much deeper connection, something that went beyond the walls and floors, beyond the noises. It was inside, in the very fabric of the house itself, and it was inside me too. As I stood in the attic, the noise of footsteps once again echoed behind me, closer this time. I turned around, but the room was empty. The cold air rushed past me, and I knew with a sickening certainty that the house had claimed me. It had claimed Robert before me, and now it was my turn. The fear, the paranoia, it wasn't just in my mind anymore, it was real. And as the noise continued to build, as the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, I realized that no matter how much I wanted to escape, no matter how hard I tried, there was no escaping the house. There was no escaping what was inside it. The night had come for me, and there was nowhere left to run. The house felt different tonight, heavier, as though the air itself was thick with anticipation. It was as if everything had been building up to this one, inevitable moment. The noises, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, they had all been leading to this. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood at the foot of the staircase, staring up into the dark, gaping hallway above me. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for me to make the first move. For weeks, I had been haunted by the thought of what lay behind that door. What was it that I had felt, that I had seen, that had slowly taken root inside my mind? The whispers that had started as faint echoes in the corners of the house had grown louder, closer, until they felt like a part of me. But now, standing at the threshold of the unknown, I realized that this moment was more than just a physical confrontation. It was a battle of the mind, a test of everything I had been avoiding. The door at the end of the hall beckoned to me like a siren song. I had seen it in my dreams, heard it in my waking moments, the faint creak of its hinges calling me toward it. With every step I took toward it, my body became heavier, my movements slower, as if the house itself was trying to keep me from reaching it. Yet, something inside me pushed me forward. The fear was palpable, but so was the need to confront it, to finally face whatever had been tormenting me. As I reached for the door, I felt the temperature drop around me. The chill in the air cut through my skin, raising goosebumps across my arms. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling just inches from the knob. I took a deep breath and turned it, the old wood creaking as the door slowly inched open. But as it swung wide, I didn't see the entity standing there as I had expected. Instead, I saw my own reflection, distorted in the dim light of the hallway. For a brief moment, I thought I was looking into the past, the version of myself that had entered this house with hope and curiosity. But then the truth hit me. It wasn't the house that had been tormenting me. It was my own mind. The real horror had been inside me all along. I stepped forward into the room, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in around me. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. There was no ghost, no figure waiting to confront me. But there was something far more terrifying. The silence, the stillness. Everything that had haunted me in the past weeks was suddenly alive, surrounding me, pressing down on me. And then I saw it, a shadow just beyond the corner of my vision. It flickered and shifted as though it were both real and imagined. My mind raced. Was it real? Or was I just losing my grip on reality? The more I tried to focus on it, the more it seemed to slip away like smoke in my hands. The fear that had consumed me all this time slowly began to unravel, piece by piece. I wasn't just facing a malevolent force in the house. I was facing my own deepest fears, the fear of being alone, of being trapped in my own mind, of losing control. The entity, the house, the noises, it was all a manifestation of my own anxiety, my own trauma, and my own guilt. I had been so focused on the external, on the tangible world around me, that I had failed to see the truth. The house wasn't haunted by a spirit or some ancient curse. It was haunted by my own inability to face the darkness within myself. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been running, hiding, trying to escape from something that wasn't a thing. It was a part of me, a part I had ignored, buried deep down because I was too afraid to confront it. The house had simply been a reflection of my own mind, a mirror, warped and distorted, showing me the shadows I had tried so hard to keep hidden. As I stood there, in the heart of the house, I felt a deep sense of both horror and clarity. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in once more. But this time, I didn't feel the same panic that had gripped me before. This time, I wasn't running. I was standing my ground. I was face to face with myself. The fear, the entity, the overwhelming sensation that something was watching me. They were all just fragments of my own psyche projecting themselves into the world. It was my own self-doubt, my shame, my guilt, all of it, brought to life in the form of the house, the noises, the shadows. The more I understood this, the more I felt the weight of my own fears start to lift. It wasn't the house that needed to be confronted. It was me. But that didn't mean the battle was over. It wasn't enough to simply understand what had been happening. I had to make a choice, fight or escape. In that moment, my survival instinct kicked in. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to leave this place behind and never look back. But I knew I couldn't. Not this time. I had been running from myself for too long. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment I thought I had made the wrong choice. The house seemed to breathe, to shift, to close in on me once again. But instead of succumbing to the fear, I stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, I faced what was left of the shadows, the fragments of my own guilt, my own sorrow, my own terror. And I said, I am not afraid anymore. For the first time since I had entered this house, I felt a strange peace wash over me. The noises, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, they all disappeared, fading into nothingness as if they had never been real. The house was no longer a prison. It was a place where I had confronted the truth, and in doing so had freed myself. But even as I stood there, in the quiet aftermath of my battle, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly won? Or was the house simply waiting for me to slip, to falter, to give in to the darkness once more? I left that night, walking away from the house that had once held me captive. But as I looked back one final time, I felt a strange, unsettling sensation. The house was still there, and in some way, so was the fear. Perhaps in the end, it wasn't just the house that haunted me. It was myself. The house had been left behind, its walls still whispering its secrets. But now as I stood far away from it, in a place that should have felt like safety, something unsettling lingered. The fear had dissipated. At least that's what I had convinced myself of. But the feeling, the subtle anxiety had taken its place. It wasn't an overwhelming terror anymore. No, it had become quieter, more insidious. The peace I had hoped for, the clarity I had longed to find, was tainted by an unease I couldn't quite shake off. It had been days since I had walked away from that cursed house. The quiet that followed that final night when I had confronted my fears should have felt like freedom. And yet, every time I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but feel as though something was watching me. The shadows in the corners of my room, the soft creak of the floorboards late at night, it all seemed so familiar, so reminiscent of the house I had left behind. I tried to tell myself it was just the echoes of the past, the lingering effects of what had happened there. But the longer I stayed away from the house, the more I realized the terror hadn't vanished. It had simply evolved. At night, when the world around me was still, when everything was supposed to be calm, I heard the whispers again. Faint at first, almost like a breeze slipping through the cracks of my mind. I would wake up, heart racing, but no one was there. The same chilling sensation would sweep over me, the feeling of being watched, that sense of something unseen lurking just out of reach. But was it truly the spirit from the house, or was it simply my mind, haunted by the past? I had told myself that I had faced the entity, that I had defeated the fear, but deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. Had the house truly been the source of my torment, or had it merely been the catalyst for something that had always been inside me? I couldn't escape the thought. What if the spirit hadn't really gone? What if it was still following me, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how fragile my sense of security was. I hadn't left the house unscathed. The horrors I had experienced were no longer confined to its walls. The entity, the feeling of dread, was now a part of me. My mind had been shattered, my perceptions warped by the events that had unfolded. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and I couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that something was still there, lingering just out of sight. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move forward. I kept myself busy, surrounded by people, and immersed in distractions. But it didn't work. The feeling remained ever present, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. It was like a memory that refused to fade, an itch that I couldn't quite scratch. One evening, I sat in my apartment, staring out the window at the moonlit sky. The city was quiet, peaceful even, but inside, I was a mess of conflicting emotions. The thought of returning to the house, of confronting the entity once more had crossed my mind, but a part of me, perhaps the strongest part, was terrified of what I would find if I went back. What if the entity had never really left? What if it was waiting for me to come back, to face it again? As I sat there in the silence, I heard a soft creak from behind me. It was so faint, I almost thought I had imagined it. But then I heard it again, the floorboards shifting, just like they had in that house. My breath caught in my throat. My heart began to race, and the room suddenly felt colder. I stood up quickly, spinning around to see nothing but the dim glow of the lamp in the corner. The apartment was empty, but that was the thing about fear, wasn't it? It didn't need to be rational. It didn't need to make sense. Fear could make you see things that weren't there, could make you hear things in the silence. I walked cautiously toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the room. As I reached the spot where I had heard the noise, I stopped, my breath shallow. I didn't know what I expected to find, but all I could see was the same familiar room, the same walls that had once offered me comfort. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. It was there, heavy and undeniable, like a presence just beyond my reach. And suddenly, I realized that it wasn't the house that haunted me. It was the fear itself, the fear that I hadn't truly escaped, that I hadn't fully confronted the darkness within myself. I sat back down, my heart pounding, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Had I really faced the spirit? Had I confronted it? Or had I merely made peace with my own fear? And even if I had, what was to stop it from returning? What was to stop the darkness from claiming me once more? The truth, as unsettling as it was that I didn't know. I didn't know if the spirit was still with me, or if it had merely been a figment of my imagination. But what I did know was that I couldn't keep running. The fear would always be a part of me, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to resurface. So, as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I couldn't help but wonder, is the spirit still with me, or has it simply become a part of who I am? And in that moment, I realized the true horror wasn't the entity that haunted me, but the fact that I would never truly know the answer. The story didn't end when I walked away from that house. The shadows, the fear, the haunting, they would follow me for as long as I lived. But whether they were truly real or just a part of my own psyche, that was something I would never be able to fully comprehend. And so the questions lingered, unanswered, forever in the back of my mind. Is it really over, or is it just beginning? It all started when I moved into this old house, which on the surface seemed like just another typical home. It wasn't new, certainly not modern, but there was something oddly charming about it. The house had an air of mystery, something that caught my attention the moment I walked in. The walls, though covered in faded wallpaper, had a certain warmth to them. The floors creaked, the kind of creaks that echoed with a sense of history, as though the house had been waiting for me to enter. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. I unpacked my things, set up my furniture, and began to get comfortable in my new surroundings. The house was spacious, too spacious for one person, really. But that was part of the appeal. It felt like there was room to breathe, space to live. I didn't think too much about the little oddities I noticed here and there, how the hallway seemed a little longer than it should be, or how the windowsills looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. These were just small, unimportant things I thought, easily explained away by the house's age. But then it started. There were the faint whispers in the corners of my mind, the subtle sounds in the middle of the night. At first, it was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees outside, or the old pipes groaning with the house settling into its foundations. But as the days went on, these sounds became different, more deliberate, like the house was speaking to me, trying to communicate in a way I couldn't quite understand. The walls, once welcoming and homey, now seemed to hold secrets. The faded paint on them seemed to shift in the soft moonlight that spilled through the curtains each night. The rooms, though cozy and inviting during the day, felt colder at night, the kind of cold that no heater could ever seem to warm up. I remember the first time I really noticed it, the way the moonlight seemed to move across the room, casting strange shadows that didn't match the furniture or the objects around them. It wasn't the kind of natural shadow that would come from a lamp or a candle. It was more like the shadows had a life of their own, stretching and recoiling at odd angles. The curtains were thick and heavy, dark against the pale light of the moon. They felt like they were hiding something, something just out of view, something that shouldn't be looked at too closely. I could feel it, a strange sense of something lurking just behind the fabric, just beyond the light. Each night I'd find myself drawn to the windows, staring out into the yard, but the longer I looked, the more unsettled I felt. I tried to shake it off, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But every time I turned off the lights and settled into bed, there was this nagging feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. It wasn't overt. There were no loud noises, no sudden bangs, nothing to suggest danger. But it was there, creeping up the back of my neck like a soft breeze, barely noticeable but always present. And as the nights went on, that feeling only grew. It all started on the first night I spent in that house. I had just finished unpacking and was finally settling down for a much-needed rest. The bed felt oddly comforting, and the room, though unfamiliar, was calm. The pale light from the moon filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything was quiet, too quiet. As I closed my eyes, trying to let the exhaustion of the day melt away, something caught my attention. It was a faint sound, distant like a creaking floorboard or the rustle of something brushing against the walls. My first instinct was to dismiss it, perhaps just the house settling, a common occurrence in old buildings. But then the sound came again. This time, it was closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house. I lay there, staring into the darkness, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it could be. The sound wasn't rhythmic or predictable, just random, like something trying to make itself known. The sound of something, or someone, moving. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew it was different. The atmosphere in the room had shifted subtly, like the air itself was charged with something I couldn't identify. I turned over, trying to force myself to sleep, but the noises persisted. They had a peculiar rhythm now, almost as if they were in sync with my own heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It was like the house was trying to tell me something, but the message was lost in the noise. As the days passed, the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they grew more persistent. I could hear them now, not just at night, but during the day too. Creaking floorboards, the rustling of what seemed like distant whispers, the faint sound of something dragging across the wooden floors. At first, I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, but the longer I stayed there, the more unsettling it became. Every night, as darkness descended, my senses heightened. Every small noise, the flickering of the lights, the distant hum of an old radiator, the groaning of the floorboards, made me jump. I could hear the wind outside, brushing against the windows, but it never felt like it was the wind. It felt like something more, something watching. Every time I tried to focus on something else, the noises would intensify, breaking my concentration and pulling me back into the unease that lingered in the corners of the room. I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks and groans around me. Each sound seemed to echo in my mind, amplifying my sense of dread. I was becoming hyper aware of every little thing. A door gently swinging open, the rustle of something moving in the hallway, a faint tapping against the wall, all of it made my heart race. The house felt alive, as though it had a consciousness, and it was watching me. The sound of footsteps on the floor became a daily occurrence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The footsteps were always just out of reach, never close enough for me to see where they were coming, but I could feel them. Each night, they seemed to grow louder, more deliberate. The house wasn't just creaking, it was talking. And the message, though unclear, was one I couldn't ignore any longer. The worst part was the sense that I was never truly alone. At night, when the sounds were at their peak, I would often lie awake, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But then, there would be moments when I felt it, the feeling that someone was standing just behind me. I could never explain it, but it was as if something was watching me, studying me, waiting. There were times when I would catch fleeting glimpses of shadows moving in the corner of my vision. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the moonlight played across the walls. But these shadows didn't behave like normal shadows. They would shift in strange, unnatural ways, stretching out and then retracting, like they had a life of their own. The worst part? There was no source. The light was coming from the window, but the shadows seemed to come from nowhere. Each night, I would try to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I would feel as though something was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. I could almost hear breathing behind me, slow, steady, deliberate, like something was waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. But when I would turn around, there was nothing, no one, just the empty, dark room. But the sense of unease didn't go away. It only deepened, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't explain it. These sensations were not like the typical creaks of an old house. They were something else entirely, something darker, something that seemed to know I was there, but I had no idea what it was. The more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feeling became. It wasn't just shadows anymore. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, as if the house was alive and aware of me. I could hear whispers now, soft murmurs in the dark, and when I tried to pinpoint where they were coming from, I found nothing. No person, no source, just the strange hum of the house, as though it was breathing along with me. These strange noises, the shadows, the whispers, they all continued to build. The tension, like a slow, creeping fog, began to consume me. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if something truly sinister was at work in that old house. But one thing was certain: the feeling of being watched never left. It only grew stronger with each passing day, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house, and whatever was inside it, wasn't going to let me go so easily. I spent days trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the eerie presence in the house never seemed to fade. My curiosity, which had initially been a quiet hum in the background, grew louder and louder each night. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was happening in this place. The noises, the whispers, the shadows. There had to be a reason for them. I couldn't keep living in fear without understanding what was truly behind it. I started my investigation by looking into the history of the house. The more I dug, the darker the story became. I scoured old records, diaries, and local newspapers, hoping to uncover something that could explain the strange happenings. It didn't take long for me to discover a tragedy that had occurred here many years ago. The house had once belonged to a family, and one of their members, a young woman, had died under mysterious circumstances. The records were vague, but the whispers from the past seemed to hint at something far more sinister. The more I learned, the more unsettled I became. According to some of the old diaries I found, the woman had been involved in practices that connected her to forces beyond this world. She had dabbled in the occult, seeking contact with spirits from the other side. There were mentions of strange rituals and symbols, things that were far beyond my understanding. But one thing was clear: whatever she had done, it had left a mark on this house. It had awakened something dark, something that had been lying dormant for years. The more I read, the more I felt like I was being drawn deeper into a web of mystery and fear. I couldn't ignore the pull to learn more, to piece together the truth. But with each discovery, the house seemed to grow more oppressive. The air became heavier, the whispers louder. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Or was something truly wrong here? It was as if the house was responding to my search, to my attempts to uncover its secrets. Then came the first real encounter with whatever presence lingered in the house. It wasn't a dramatic, ghostly apparition or a loud crash. It was something much more subtle, but no less terrifying. I had just finished reading one of the diaries when I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me, barely audible over the sound of my breathing. I froze, my heart racing, my body paralyzed with fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could feel the presence behind me, just out of sight. I dared not turn around, too afraid of what I might see. And then, as quickly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The room was still. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Or had something truly been there, walking just behind me? I decided to keep searching, despite the growing terror that gripped me. But as I went deeper into the history of the house, things began to take a darker turn. I started noticing strange objects in the house that I hadn't seen before. Old photographs, some of them torn and faded, others almost too clear. faces that I didn't recognize, people who didn't belong in this house, yet their presence seemed to linger in every corner. One evening, as I was sifting through some old letters in the attic, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a small, intricately carved box, hidden beneath a pile of forgotten objects. I couldn't resist the urge to open it. Inside was a strange collection of items, symbols, feathers, and an old key. I didn't know what it all meant, but it was clear that whatever this box contained, it was connected to the dark forces I had uncovered in the house's history. The more I looked into it, the more I realized that these objects weren't just relics, they were a part of something bigger, something that was still very much alive. The more I tried to understand, the more unsettling details emerged. The house wasn't just haunted by the memory of the woman who had lived there. It was haunted by something she had unleashed, something that had been waiting for the right moment to make itself known again. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier with each passing day. The whispers turned into murmurs, and the shadows began to move with purpose, as if they were following me. I could feel the presence growing stronger, more insistent, as if it was aware of my every move. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if the house was slowly consuming me. I couldn't escape it. The presence, the whispers, the strange objects, they were all part of something I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear. The house had never been just a house. It was a gateway, a door to something far darker, something that had been waiting for the right person to unlock it. And now it seemed that person was me. The sounds grew louder. What had started as subtle whispers in the walls, faint creaks in the floorboards, had now become distinct, almost purposeful. Every night it was the same. Soft tapping, the sound of something, or someone, moving just out of reach. At first I dismissed it, telling myself it was the house settling, the wind brushing against the windows. But now the noises were more persistent, and with each passing night, they seemed to grow in intensity. They were no longer distant. They were right there, just on the edge of my perception. I couldn't ignore them any longer. I tried to stay calm. I knew I had to keep my composure, but the tension in the air was suffocating. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control, questioning everything around me. The sounds became clearer each night. What had once been a faint rattle now felt like something actively moving through the house. Sometimes, I'd hear the sound of someone pacing in the hall outside my door, and when I opened it, nothing would be there. The walls creaked as if they were sighing under some invisible weight, as if the house itself was breathing. I would lie awake in bed, every muscle tense, waiting for the next noise to break the silence. It wasn't the sounds alone that bothered me. It was the feeling that they were meant for me, that they were deliberate. Something in the house was awake, and it knew I was here. The physical manifestations of my growing fear began to take shape. The objects in the house, once simple things, started to shift. A chair that had been in the same spot for days now appeared to be slightly out of place. The old painting on the wall that had never caught my eye seemed to be watching me, its eyes following my every movement. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw it. A book that had been resting on the shelf had moved, just a few inches, but enough to notice. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was toying with me, something beyond my control. The more I tried to rationalize, the more the house seemed to rebel. My nights were filled with constant unease. Every creak, every rustle, every gust of wind that brushed past the window felt like it carried an unspoken warning. I started questioning myself. Was this real? Was it possible that the sounds, the movements, the feeling of being watched, was it all just a figment of my imagination, a product of stress, Or was the house truly alive with some malevolent force? But even as I questioned my sanity, the events continued. It was as if my mind had opened a door, and whatever was on the other side was now pushing its way into my reality. The turning point came one night as I sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. I could hear the tapping again, but this time it was closer. It was as if someone was knocking on the door, but when I opened it, there was nothing, just emptiness. And yet, the tapping continued, now from the other side of the room. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but again I saw nothing. My heart raced as my eyes darted from corner to corner, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, unmistakable and heavy, the kind of sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. This was no longer just a noise, it was a presence that I couldn't escape. I followed the sound, almost against my will, as if something was pulling me toward it. My body moved on its own, driven by a force I couldn't explain. As I reached the hallway, the temperature dropped, the air thick with an oppressive heaviness. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I reached the stairs, and for the first time I felt a chill that was not of this world, a cold that seeped into my bones, leaving me frozen in place. The footsteps stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the only sound in the house. But then, as if to answer my fear, the air shifted. A faint whisper, barely audible, slipped into my consciousness, sending a wave of terror through me. Leave. It was a command. Simple. Final. The whisper echoed through the house, and I froze, not knowing what to do. Was it real? Had I imagined it? But then the house groaned, as though it were alive, and the whisper came again, more forceful this time. Leave. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was rooted to the spot. I could feel the weight of the presence pressing down on me, as if the very air around me was alive with malevolent intent. It was no longer just the house that was haunted. It was something else, something that had been here long before me and would remain long after I was gone. At that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. The house was not just a place. It was a threshold, a boundary between two worlds, and something from the other side had crossed over. I turned and fled, the sound of footsteps following me, growing louder with every step I took. My mind raced with one thought: escape. But where could I run when the very walls of the house seemed to close in on me, trapping me in its suffocating grasp? As I stumbled through the dark halls, the presence followed. I could hear it, feel it, every step echoing behind me. There was no escape. The house had become my prison, and the entity within had claimed its hold over me. The fear that had once been a mere whisper in the corners of my mind was now a full-blown nightmare, something that had come to life. And no matter how fast I ran, it was always right behind me. The physical manifestation of my fears was now undeniable. The house had become a living, breathing thing. My doubts, my questions about whether this was all in my mind had been shattered. There was no question anymore. Whatever was in this house was real, and it was waiting for me to face it. But the question remained: what did it want from me? And would I survive the nightmare it had set in motion? The air was thick with the heavy silence that filled the house. The walls seemed to be closing in on me as I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the dark abyss below. The house, once a place of comfort, had transformed into a living nightmare. Every creak, every shadow, every strange noise felt like a direct challenge, daring me to confront what lay beneath the surface. I had tried to ignore it for so long. The strange sounds, the shifting objects, the whispers in the night, they all pointed to something more sinister than I could comprehend. But now I knew. I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't just the house settling or my imagination running wild. It was something far darker, something that had been waiting for me, lurking just beneath the surface of the everyday. The footsteps started again, slow, deliberate, and growing closer. My heart raced in my chest, each beat pounding in my ears. I tried to move, to escape, but my body betrayed me, frozen in place by the overwhelming fear that gripped me. The floorboards creaked under an unseen weight, the air growing colder with each passing second. Then, as if on cue, the temperature plummeted. A coldness seeped into the room, wrapping itself around me like an invisible hand. My breath became shallow, visible in the frozen air, and I could see my own pulse fluttering in the skin of my neck. It was happening. I was about to face whatever had haunted me for all these nights. The house groaned, and with it, the presence. It moved with purpose, like a force of nature that couldn't be ignored. I turned slowly, almost unwillingly, to face the hallway that stretched before me. The shadows seemed to shift, moving of their own accord, forming shapes that were not quite human, but not entirely not either. I took a deep breath, the air burning my lungs as I forced myself to move forward, each step heavy and uncertain. And then I saw it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even an entity I could fully comprehend. It was something else, a shape in the darkness, a twisted reflection of all my fears, manifesting in front of me. The air seemed to hum with its presence, vibrating with a sound that wasn't quite a sound, but more of a sensation that pierced through my body. It was as if the very atmosphere around me had become suffocating, charged with a terrifying energy that I could feel deep in my bones. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing. Was this real? Was it possible that I was standing in front of the very thing that had been tormenting me all this time? Or was this just the culmination of my worst nightmares brought to life by my own fear? The entity didn't speak, at least not with words, but I could feel it communicating, its presence a constant pressure on my mind. It was as if it was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. I could see its form shift, almost like smoke, but with an eerie solidity to it that made it impossible to dismiss as a figment of my imagination. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. This was no mere spirit or ghost. This was something older, something more primal. It was a force that had been waiting, watching, and now it had chosen me. The question wasn't whether it was real or not. It was whether I would survive this confrontation. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I fought it back. I couldn't let this thing see me break. I had to confront it, to face it head on. The choice was clear: fight or run. I took a step forward, my legs shaking beneath me, but my resolve stronger than ever. I wasn't going to let it win. I wasn't going to let this thing take control of me any longer. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into my skin. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the pulse pounding in my ears as I took another step. The presence loomed closer, its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I could see it more clearly now, the tendrils of darkness swirling around it, like some monstrous shadow that was just barely contained. And then, in that instant, I understood. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was me. This thing, whatever it was, had been feeding on my fear, drawing power from my doubts, from my insecurities. It wasn't just a physical entity. It was a manifestation of everything I had been running from, everything I had been too afraid to face. In that moment, I realized that running wasn't an option. I had to confront it, not just physically, but mentally. I had to face the fear that had been festering inside me all this time, the fear that I had tried to push away, to ignore. I turned to face it fully, not as a victim, but as someone who had finally accepted the challenge. The presence seemed to recoil, as though surprised by my sudden shift in demeanor. It hesitated, as if unsure of what to do next. I took another step forward, my voice trembling as I spoke. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The entity paused, the air around us thick with tension. It seemed to weigh my words, as if considering them. The temperature in the room dropped even further, but I stood my ground. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. Suddenly, the entity lunged at me, its form blurring into a mass of darkness that seemed to swallow the room whole. My instincts screamed at me to run, to escape, but I didn't. I fought against the terror that clawed at me, refusing to let it control me any longer. I could feel the force of its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. But I stood tall, my will stronger than it had ever been before. And then, in a flash of blinding light, everything went still. The entity was gone. I stood there, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was warm again, and the darkness that had once filled the house seemed to lift. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on me for so long was gone. I had faced my greatest fear and survived. But as I stood there, looking around at the empty hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew that I would never be the same. The house was silent now, but I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly defeated it? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? The question lingered in my mind as I walked away from the stairs, uncertain of what the future held, but knowing that I had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. The days following that final confrontation were a blur, a mix of confusion and relief. I had faced the entity, stood my ground, and walked away from the house without looking back. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The house felt different now, quieter, as though something had been lifted, but the silence was not comforting. It was unsettling, a vacuum that had replaced the heavy presence that had once filled the rooms. I tried to convince myself that everything had ended, that whatever force had been haunting me was gone for good. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows in my room would shift, just slightly, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. The air would grow cold, just like it had on that final night, and for a moment, I would feel the same pressure on my chest, the same overwhelming sense of being watched. Was it real? Or had my mind, exhausted from the trauma, simply conjured up these sensations? Each time, I would convince myself that it was just a remnant of my fear, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to brush it off, the more persistent it became. I would sit in my room, staring at the walls, waiting for the silence to break, for the familiar noise, the creak of the floorboards, or the flutter of curtains, to tell me that something was wrong again. But nothing ever came, and yet it still felt wrong. Was I imagining it? Had I finally snapped, my mind finally giving in to the madness I had been fighting for so long? The line between reality and nightmare was now blurred. I couldn't tell if I was still haunted by the spirit of the house, or if I had become my own worst enemy. Every day felt like a test. Was I truly free, or had the entity simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to return? The uncertainty ate at me. It was as if the house had become a part of me, as if its presence had been ingrained in my very soul. The air in the house felt different, yes, but the memories, the lingering fear, the doubt, the shadows remained. I would walk down the hall, And sometimes I would hear the faintest sound, a whisper almost, just on the edge of hearing. It would vanish as quickly as it came, but it would leave me shaking. A brush of cold air would sweep past me, and I would freeze, holding my breath, waiting. Was it the wind, or was it something more? I found myself questioning everything, my thoughts spiraling. Maybe I had never truly defeated the spirit. Maybe the entity was still here, waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. Or maybe, just maybe, I had never been dealing with an external force at all. Maybe it was all in my head, a manifestation of my own fears and insecurities, brought to life by the pressure of the house, the isolation, and the fear of the unknown. I started to notice things I hadn't before, small, insignificant things. The way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long at dusk, the way the curtains fluttered even when there was no wind, the way the floor creaked in places I hadn't walked. I told myself it was nothing. It was all in my mind. The house was old, and old houses made noise. That's all it was. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, something watching me. Was it the spirit, or was it just my mind, forever haunted by the memories of what had happened? I found myself staring at the old photographs hanging on the walls, wondering if any of them held a clue, something I had missed before. There was one in particular, a faded image of the house from years ago, taken before it had fallen into disrepair. It showed the house in its prime, a proud structure standing tall against the horizon. But there was something strange about the photo, something I hadn't noticed until now. In the corner of the frame, just behind the window, there was a shadow, a dark, indistinct shape that shouldn't have been there. I had never seen it before. I wondered if it had always been there, or if it had appeared after the entity had made its presence known to me. I turned away from the photo, my mind racing. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong. I wasn't sure if it was the house, the entity, or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew one thing. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I moved, no matter how much time passed, the feeling would always be with me. The house had changed me. I was no longer the person I had been when I first walked through those doors. My fear, my doubts, had shaped me into something new. And maybe, just maybe, I was the one who was truly haunted now. I walked to the door, my hand resting on the handle, and for a moment I considered leaving. But then I hesitated. Was it really over? Was the entity truly gone? Or was I simply too afraid to face the truth? The door creaked open, and the house seemed to sigh with relief, as if acknowledging my presence. Or was it just my mind? I couldn't tell anymore. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt it again. The faintest touch, a brush of cold air against my skin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, stretching and twisting in ways they shouldn't. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew. The spirit, whatever it was still here. Or maybe it had never left. I couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. I was never going to escape it.